3 months now, what has become known as the YouTube revolution has produced grainy but dramatic images broadcast around the world of the Syrian people attempting to break free from decades of repression. Who are these protesters and what do they want?
Syria belongs to the Syrians, not to the Assad family.
Freedom means so much to us Syrian women. That is why I have gone out onto the streets, risked the bullets, and protested.
ضرورة وقف القتل وسحب الجيش من المدن.
How can they hope to succeed against a regime prepared to use lethal force to stay in power? With Western journalists barred outright or unable to work freely, I travelled undercover to Damascus to find out. It was surprisingly easy to get into the country, posing as a tourist with a small camera. But once here in Damascus, the difficulties began. If I booked into an hotel, I was told I would be followed. My contacts took me to an empty flat in a suburb of the city. To accommodate a journalist at home would put them in jail, they explained. I had to lock the doors and keep the blinds drawn. I have to sit here in hiding for hours at a time, waiting to get a message from one of the activists I'm working with here to tell me when it's safe enough to go into Damascus to meet with them. It is a frustrating way to report on the uprising here in Syria, but not as difficult as it is for those who are trying to bring about change in this country. I soon found I was not alone in my predicament. Nearly everyone I met was on the run and in hiding from Syria's ubiquitous mukhabarat, the secret police. Political activists are now scattered around the city, hiding in borrowed rooms and flats to avoid arrest. Why do they risk so much?
I'm doing this because I want to live in a better place. I want a secular, democratic country that respects human rights, that respects my dignity, in which I can say what I believe in without thinking of consequences of being detained. Like, for example, doing this interview with my real name and with my face facing the camera.
Mustafa explained how the opposition works. There are 3 categories of activists in the country.
They are the frontline or the protesters, and also the coordinators and the advocates who would promote what the protesters are doing on the ground. Sometimes I go and monitor the protests, for example driving my car to go there and I just watch myself what's going on there. And then I come home, I report this to some of the news agencies or channels, and I would publish everything I see, everything I get on a page I'm running on Facebook. It's called Monitoring Protests in Syria.
Elsewhere in the city, Aliyah is also in hiding. The mother of a young daughter, she's anxious to remain anonymous, but she is a frontline demonstrator. Why?
I don't want my daughter to grow up like I did, having always to say something in one place and something else in another. I want her to be free. I want her to say what she wants, where she wants, when she wants. My daughter watches the TV and she hears us chanting, "Al-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam." That means people want the downfall of the regime. And in her innocence, she repeated this in school, and the teacher got really angry and shouted at her and told her she had to praise the president. I found Amer, a 26-year-old journalist, writing his will. He would call himself an advocate. They caught him before he had a chance to hide.
السجن هاي كانت أول تجربة سجن لإلي. كان كتير شيء قاسي بالنسبة لإلي وشيء مخيف. كنت كتير خايف. بعد ثاني جلسة تعذيب ضليت 8 أيام بمنفردة لحالي. بعدها قالوا لي نحن رح نطلعك، فضربني مدير ما بعرف، نزل لعندي مدير الفرع، بزق بوشي، قال لي أنت رح يكون لك مستقبل كتير منيح، أنت صحفي كتير منيح، بس أنت غبي، خربت بيتك بإيدك.
His crime was to report on the protest and to cast doubt on the president's promise of reform. What does Amer think real reform is?
الشعب السوري يحلم أنه يعيش بدولة بها قانون، يعيش بكرامته، يعيش حر بعيدا عن تسلط أجهزة الأمن، بدولة ما يتحكم بها عصابات أمن.
The Syrian uprising began back in March in the town of Daraa, when demonstrations broke out on behalf of a group of school children who were arrested after calling for God, Syria and freedom. Such demonstrations are illegal in Syria under the decades-old emergency law, and people here were demanding that the law be abolished. The security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters. At this point, Syrian dissidents outside the country smuggled hundreds of satellite phones across the border so that people inside and outside Syria would see what happened next.
The demonstrations started when people saw what happened in Daraa and then in Banyas. People saw the videos that were uploaded, and this is just a small part, perhaps 5% of what is really happening in Syria. What is happening in Syria is really terrifying. The first time, they responded by firing at us. The security forces provoked the protesters. They took up firing positions. They pointed their guns at the protesters. Some of the young men bared their chests and they said, "If you are a man, fire. We face you with our chests bared. We are not worth more than the people of Daraa. We shall die as they died. We are seekers of freedom."
But many of those first seekers of freedom were known to the authorities. They had to flee to neighboring Lebanon to join a growing number of Syrian exiles who now work as advocates abroad. Like Rami and Omar, who now upload the footage as it arrives from Syria, check it and, vitally, distribute it.
هذا الحي هو الحي اللي أنا تربيت فيه وعشت فيه. هدول الناس اللي هلأ واقفين ممكن يبينوا بالشاشة هن ناس أنا بعرفهم، ناس عايش معهم، ناس أغلبهم أصدقاء لنا أو أهلهم أصدقاء لنا. نحن هلأ الفيديو عم نسمع كيف إطلاق النار الكثيف فيه. بداية الشارع ونهاية هذا الشارع بيتمركزوا فيه مدرعات.
Omar then contacts journalists and human rights organizations with the latest news on fatalities and information on who might have been arrested.
الكثير من الحماية نؤمنها للناشطين الذين يعرضون للاعتقال. عندما نعلن عنهم وعندما نروج أسمائهم وعندما نترك وسائل الإعلام تتحدث عنهم نحفظ لهم حياتهم من التصفية في المعتقلات. لنا تجارب سابقة مع هذا النظام الذي صف الكثير من الناشطين السياسيين في المعتقلات. في الحقيقة أنا أقوم هنا بدور جيد وأنا راض عنه، ولكني أطمح أن أكون بينهم وأحلم أن أكون بينهم، أن يتاح لي الظرف المناسب للعودة مرة أخرى لأكون بينهم مهما كلف الثمن، يعني لا يهم.
The uprising continued. Video material uploaded to YouTube inspired thousands to attend the demonstrations, despite the risk. Army brutality has been bravely documented by those who continue to wield the vital weapon of this revolution, the smartphone. The beatings and the killings have been indiscriminate. meted out to adults and children alike. The most horrific example of which was the abduction, torture and murder of 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib. Occasionally it has become too much even for soldiers, many of whom have deserted. They too have fled across the border. Qataba explained that he could no longer take orders from his commanding officers. Syrians taking refuge here on the border with Lebanon ask not to be identified. They hope to return one day.
أعطونا أمر بإطلاق النار بشكل كثيف جدا 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 على المدنيين العزل وعلى الأبنية ما راعوا أي لا يعني ما حتى مسلحين بالأعين المجردة ما شفناها الأغلبية العالم ما شافتها مسلحين. صار في قتلى ضحايا كثير من المدنيين العزل يعني. كان كلمة العميد ذخيرة كثير وطلوق النار كثير. ذخيرة كثير وطلوق النار هاي كلمته. ذخيرة فيه كثير وطلوق النار كثير ما راح يحاسبك على الذخيرة. هاي الكلمة كانت تطلع من العميد. كنا نطلق نار الواعيين طبعا كنا نطلق خراب الجو أو على بناء خالي تماما بيكون يعني على العظم لأنه كنا نعرف يوم بيعرفوا واحد إنه ما عم يطلق نار عم يعتقلوه ويروح لجهة غير معينة ونعرفوني أو يغتال.
The refugees in eastern Lebanon can see the Syrian troops across the border. It was the threat that these men now pose to the women of Syria which forced Khaloud to leave the country.
الأرض غالي والعرض غالي. الأرض الشباب بتحمي والشرف لازم الإنسان اللي حامل الشرف هو بيحمي. إننا نحن رايبين ببانياس وبحمص وبتلبيسة لما نحكي معهم يحكوا لنا أشياء كتير مرعبة إنه هدروا أعراض الناس كلياتها. اللي ما يقدر يطلع برا مثل تلبيسه وحمص ما هني على مناطق حدودية وين بده يروحوا صاروا يفوتوا على بيوت ويفتحوا الحريمات هدروا شرفهم كلياته شو يعني إذا بقول لك خناز كفار ما بيخافوا الله صدق.
Khaloud fled with another group of women and their daughters. She left her 3 adult sons in Syria.
إذا بكذب عليك وبقول لك والله كلام عم قوي من معنوياتهم بس القلب من جوا عم ينزف دم. يعني لما بدي أقول لأمي قل لي يا ماما فيني قل لي يا ماما تعال لازم قل لي يا ماما ضل. كل أم بتتمنى أولادها يكونوا حدها بس في شيء أقوى من الشعور الأم لازم يكون في تضحية لحتى نقدر ننتصر على الكفار. يعني إذا أنا أولادي بدي يكونوا غاليين وأولاد غيري بدي يكونوا غاليين يبقى ما عاد في نصر.
Events in Syria are now dominated by the weekly protest after Friday prayers. Who will go? Who will risk being killed by army snipers? Will they survive to return home afterwards? It's Thursday evening, the eve of what's become protest day here in Syria, and people are dashing home before the roadblocks are set up between the suburbs of Damascus and the city itself. The last thing that authorities want is for people to converge on the city, recreating the Damascus equivalent of Cairo's Tahrir Square. Even here in the prosperous middle-class suburbs, you can tell how many security guards patrol the streets by the number of times I'm told to hide my camera. People here tell you that a mass demonstration in Damascus wouldn't be like Egypt, it would be a massacre. Up until now, demonstrations in Damascus have been comparatively modest. But for opposition leader Riyad Saif, they are the highlight of his week.
I am 65 years old now and I have a cancer, but I enjoy so much going to demonstrate every Friday with these youth, which I see in them the future of Syria. And once I was caught and I was beaten very, very hard, and they put me in prison for 10 days. It was a very good opportunity for me to meet 100 of these prisoners, demonstrators, and I have heard very many horrible stories about torturing.
This was not the first time he'd been in prison. When Bashar al-Assad first came to power 10 years ago, He asked members of parliament, like Saif, to help him introduce reform. When Saif suggested a genuine democracy, he was imprisoned.
Syria belongs to the Syrian. Syria not belongs to the Assad family. And this, let's say, Assad family forever should have been stopped. It's enough.
President Assad has made 3 public speeches since the uprising began. He claims repeatedly that his country is being undermined by saboteurs. He alternates in accusing them of being supported by Israel and at other times of being part of an Islamic fundamentalist plot. Is there any truth in that?
When I went out to protest, I did not hear any purely Islamic chants. Everyone was chanting, Allah, Syria, freedom. That's what we want. Everyone was chanting for freedom. There are Syrians who are quite religious, but they do not impose religious beliefs on you.
قد يكون للنظام السوري الدور مثل بقية الأنظمة العربية في إرسال هذه المخاوف للغرب. هذه المخاوف باعتقادنا غير مبررة وغير واقعية. يعني سوريا دولة متعددة من ناحية الطوائف والمذاهب والإثنيات. لا يمكن أن يكون هناك لون واحد يحكمها.
Hazem Nahar is a physiotherapist in Damascus and opposition leader. Like so many, he was imprisoned during the current arrest and then suddenly released and asked to enter into a dialogue with the government. He refused.
نحن رأينا في الذهاب لمثل هذا الحوار بالفعل هو تنكر لما حدث خلال الفترة الماضية من قتل وتعذيب وإهانة، رغم أننا كمعارضة من حيث المبدأ مع منطق الحوار وهدف الحوار، لكن وضعنا لذلك مجموعة من المعايير.
Members of the Syrian opposition were recently allowed by the regime to meet in Damascus to discuss their grievances. Hazem Nahar and several other prominent opposition leaders didn't attend. He believes there's no point as the government would never agree to their conditions.
أول نقطة هي ضرورة وقف القتل وسحب الجيش من المدن وتحييد الأجهزة الأمنية. دعوة الحوار التي نقبلها هي دعوة علنية من رئيس الجمهورية، وأن يتم تغطية هذا الحوار من قبل وسائل الإعلام، بالإضافة إلى مشاركة الشباب وممثلي الحراك الشعبي في هذا الحوار.
The government's response has been to increase the number of pro-regime rallies. The one I saw while in Damascus was indeed an impressive sight. Not just the president's elite Alawite Shia minority, but thousands of apparently ordinary people declaring their love for their country and their president. Who are they?
مثل كل بلد في ناس منتفعين وبقية الشعب بتكون متضررة. المسألة بسوريا أنه مئات الآلاف، ممكن ببعض الجمع عم يكون في أكثر من مليون وملايين عم ينزلوا على الشارع، ما عدا الأغلبية الصامتة اللي هن جالسين ببيوتهم. في ناس رح يطلعوا يأيدوا يهتفوا باسم بشار أسد. مو كل السوريين هم ضد بشار أسد. في مليونين عنصر أمن بيشتغل بسوريا، هم إذا لحالهم طلعوا فيهم يطلعوا أكبر مظاهرة يعني.
There's little doubt that the silent majority is alarmed by the prospect of chaos engulfing the country. But people here also tell you that the disproportionate response by the authorities to the initially modest demands for reform has raised the stakes.
لما كان الرد هو الرصاص والدبابات والقتل والاعتقالات والهراوات، صاروا يطالبوا بإسقاط النظام من رأسه لأصغر عنصر أمن فيه، لأنه نظام يعني اللي يرد بهي الطريقة ما راح يقدر يقنع الناس بأي وقت آخر إنه هو ممكن يكون متزن لحتى يقدر يلبي هاي المطالب، أو أنه هو يظل حاكم لهذا البلد اللي هو قتل أبناء سجن أكثر من سجن عشرات الآلاف منه.
My main wish to see Syria free before I die, and that's what I was struggling for years for that, and I'm sure it will not be so long. That I'm very optimistic I will see it.
This weekend has seen some of the biggest demonstrations yet throughout the country. People are calling it the time to leave protest, and to drive the point home, they're holding up red cards to reinforce the point that they want Bashar al-Assad to go. In some towns, the army have responded with force, and there have been fatalities. But these recent pictures show demonstrators gaining in confidence. There's almost a carnival atmosphere. It's too early to conclude that the tide is turning in favor of the opposition, but it does appear that government troops are overstretched. It could be that there are now so many protests that they haven't got the means to respond to them all with guns.